It's Wednesday, September 4th. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast. It is a hell of a day to talk ball, and joining me to do just that for the debut of Data Dump Wednesday, it is the one and only Sal Vetri. Sal, what's going on, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic. We're in the thick of things right now. This is maybe the most exciting week of the season, right before week one. We're fresh, right? We're fresh as fantasy analysts. Now's the time to dive in.
Do you feel fresh? Because I don't 100% feel fresh, only because yesterday was not a real Monday. I feel more fresh as soon as the games start happening, probably on Sunday. But I'm glad that you feel fresh, buddy, because you're going to probably have to carry the show.
Okay, well, I'll do that. But do I feel fresh considering yesterday, was a holiday? Yeah, no, this is my Monday now. So there is a little bit of a lag over from just chilling by the pool all day and having one or two beverages. So, but we're here and we're fully focused.
Oh, man. Well, I'm jealous of the Monday that you had. I'll just say that. But like I said, this is Data Dump Wednesday. How this is going to work with Sal and I, really to try to maximize your fantasy rosters, maximize your time, and get you the best information from this show. I have 5 data points to bring. Sal has 5 data points, and then we're going to share one move to make, or maybe a few moves to make that Sal's going to bring to the table. Because if you listen to this show, you guys know I always say this. I'm pretty upfront about this. I think my worst thing I bring to the table as a fantasy player, for sure, and probably a fantasy analyst, I don't think I'm the strongest here, is trade analysis. Like, I could tell you who I think is a buy low or something like that, but actually trying to put together an offer, and just generally the reason I think the reason that a team of mine will tend to struggle is that I just don't have the time to put in to making trades during the season. But that's one of Sal's best attributes as a fantasy analyst. So I'm really excited to have that every week on this show. But like I said, the main core of this show is I'm going to bring 5 data points to the table. Sal's going to bring 5 data points. It's going to be great. We're going to give you 10 that you really need to know in this Data Dump Wednesday. But first, we're always going to start with a Wednesday kind of news and notes section, because Wednesday's a pretty heavy news and notes day during the season. And we have a lot to talk about coming off of Labor Day weekend, and really a lot of things that happened on Monday as well, starting with Brandon Ayuk, Trent Williams, and CMC are back just in time. Brandon Ayuk stays in San Francisco on a new deal. Finally, sanity reigned in that situation. Then, Tuesday morning, Trent Williams signs a new deal, goes back, holdout over, and that very same day, Christian McCaffrey practices in full. The only negative note coming out of San Francisco right now, and it's a serious note, is that rookie wide receiver Ricky Pearsall was placed on the reserve/non-football injury list after being shot over the weekend. We're just happy that Ricky Pearsall is alive and well, and making a recovery there. I think football obviously comes second in that situation. But Sal, on the field, it took a while to get there, but it seems like all is well in San Francisco, at least heading into week one.
Yeah, they're making the money come out of nowhere. Kind of helps with the rookie quarterback contract. But we talked about Trent Williams last week as probably the biggest kind of under the radar contract dispute that was going on. This guy probably wasn't going to come to the field if they didn't give him an extension, or not even an extension. He just wanted $3 million more per year, and he deserves it. So that looks like it's settled. Running to the left side, they needed him there. They don't have to have extra protection, so that helps. McCaffrey being good for week one, kind of something that's been expected. They shut him down the whole preseason, but we didn't get confirmation. Now we do. I do think that they could limit him in week one. Why pull him back off of a soft tissue type of injury, a strain to the calf? But even with that said, you're not doing anything in fantasy. You're not sitting the guy. It's a tough matchup. It could be injury concerns, but you're still playing him overall. Just maybe temper expectations from a 30-point game to a 20-point game.
Oh, we feel so bad for you, Christian McCaffrey drafters, if you have to just temper back those expectations to a mere 20 points. As we mentioned on the last episode that we got together, Sal, Trent Williams is a unique offensive lineman that I think he really does move the needle. This stat from the 33rd team, Brock Purdy splits with versus without Trent Williams on the field. With Trent Williams, 582 dropbacks, 41-11 touchdown interception ratio, pressure rate of 36%, 0.24 EPA per dropback, and a 111.4 passer rating. Without Trent Williams, 91 dropbacks, smaller sample size, but that's what you get when you get a guy who stays pretty healthy and plays a lot. 3 to 4 touchdown interception rate, 45% pressure rate, 0.18 EPA per dropback, and a 94 Passer rating, that's a pretty significant drop off. And like, still generally passer rating's okay, but the APA is not the same. I mean, this guy really does move the needle. So having him back in action is good for this entire passing game. And I'll just get your quick kind of temperature check on Brandon Ayuk. Now that we know he's a member of the 49ers, right? He's going to play. He's going to be in the same role. Do you expect this offense to basically just look like it was last year from a fantasy perspective, from a rankings perspective, especially now that we probably aren't going to have Ricky Pearsall making an impact, at least early in the season, maybe not at all. It does feel like we're just running it all back from last year.
Yeah, especially with Trent Williams back, I'm expecting it to go back. I think you might see a little bit of regression from like just a touchdown standpoint when you're talking about Brock Purdy running hot with touchdowns. Maybe that helps Christian McCaffrey on the ground or some other guys like Jordan Mason a little more. But that's how I'm projecting it. Might see a little rust week one, especially against a strong Jets secondary and defensive line. But overall, now that they're all back, yeah, I'm feeling good about it.
All right, let's move on to something that maybe doesn't feel so good if you're a Cincinnati Bengals fan. Zach Taylor on Jamar Chase's status for week one. Quote, "We'll just take it day by day." This is a little less bullish than about a week ago when Zach Taylor said he expected Jamar Chase to play week one. This thing does feel truly up in the air, Sal. And look, we're recording this right now a day before the show is going to come out. So hopefully nothing breaks in the meantime, or maybe it breaks today on Wednesday as you're hearing this. But still, do you expect Jamar Chase to show up, sign a deal, and just play in week one? Or are we getting too close to kind of the 11th hour here?
Yeah, I expect him to play, and I think Wednesday is when the pressure really comes on because they're going to start practicing, and that kind of gets to a point where coaches have to start implementing their game plan, and when you have to have a game plan for with and without Jamar Chase, it starts to get maybe a little bit annoying. Maybe the coaches start to get a little frustrated, more pressure goes on to an organization, or just to meet. It seemed like Chase was going to practice, and then Zach Taylor said that Chase is going to practice, and Chase kind of had like this, you know what, no, I don't like that someone's going to speak for me attitude to it. So it's like an antics thing right now. Mike Brown, the president of the Bengals, has already said, like, I want to pay this guy. Like, let's just get the deal done. So I think they're really close. And now in the final hours, by the time this is maybe even out and people are listening, I think he's going to be signing and playing.
If he doesn't play in week one, obviously it's brutal if you took him in the first round of fantasy, but hopefully you can survive week one. I think it becomes really interesting in week two because the Bengals should also be fine and should be able to beat the Patriots at a 1 o'clock, Eastern game. They should be able to handle that. But week two, they play the Chiefs at 4:25 Eastern on CBS. Like, that's a big game. That would be really ratcheting up the pressure if you're Jamar Chase. If no deal happens here before week one, and then you still kind of stick to your guns and you sit out week two, then I think you're really sending a message. So if he misses week one, it's at least on my radar then that they could really try to get that done for week two, because you want to beat the Chiefs and then you just want to house the Commanders and the Panthers in weeks 3 and 4. So that week two game, I think, is definitely the one that's really on my radar right now. I will just say one last note on this, Sal. It has been interesting to me, if you're watching like late draft ADP, Chase has definitely come down a little bit, as people are spooked about him potentially missing the season. I found it interesting that there's been no kind of correlated come up for T. Higgins, a guy that is a good football player. I think T. Higgins he's probably not like a top 10 receiver in the league. But he's very good. I think he could be a functional number one on another team, maybe not like an elite level number one like a Jamar Chase. I think there's a separation in talent there between those two guys. But I have just found it interesting that as drafters have shied away from Jamar Chase, they haven't then also come up on T. Higgins, who we've seen be extremely productive when Jamar Chase is not on the field.
Yeah, I think he's been a great 5th round pick is usually where you find him in fantasy drafts for people still drafting right now. I think that's great value. When he's actually been active with Joe Burrow and you take out the games that both Burrow and Higgins have left early, he averages over 14 points per game. That's a top 20 receiver. So yeah, if Chase is out of the lineup, the target share all is going to be transitioning over to T. Higgins without a Tyler Boyd as well. Not a lot of trusted pieces on that offense after that. I like it. The other thing I'll note on Jamar Chase, the thing you don't want to see is he pops up with a hamstring, ankle injury, something like that on Wednesday, and it starts to turn into the Jonathan Taylor situation from last year where PUP can come into play. I don't think that's going to happen at this point where we're at right now, but that's the thing you don't want to see if you're a Chase owner.
Right. This is not a panic meter episode, but if we did see something like that, that would be a full panic sort of situation here early in the year. Another thing we kind of expected, but Chiefs ruled out Hollywood Brown for the season opener. So I just want to kind of get your expectations for these other Chiefs receivers. We'll break down that game obviously in full throughout the week here, of course, but it's coming up tomorrow as people are listening to this. So with Hollywood Brown out, how do you expect Rashee Rice to be used, Xavier Worthy, and maybe some of those ancillary pieces as well?
Yeah, we've had a lot of excitement from camp reports to then the preseason usage of Mahomes throwing downfield more, especially with the speedy receivers in Xavier Worthy. And ideally, Hollywood Brown was going to play, but he's not. I'm maybe a little bit concerned for week one, maybe a little bit of rust. They're facing a Ravens secondary that is really good, like a top 5 unit, maybe even arguably the best in the league without Marquise Brown. With a rookie making his debut, there could be some rust there. Kyle Hamilton for the Ravens is going to be probably on Travis Kelce for a lot of that game, which is another tough matchup for somebody like Kelce. I think this could be a game where you see Rashee Rice like last year in the short to intermediate ranges, kind of a Chiefs offense from last year where they can't open it up just due to one personnel into the defensive matchup. Also plays into the hands of a Isaiah Pacheco, maybe a little bit of Samaje Perine, but I think it's mostly, at least in my opinion, going to be an Isaiah Pacheco game compared to what people are expecting from this offense for the whole year.
Yeah. Again, really fascinated to see how they use Xavier Worthy. I thought this note was interesting from Nate Taylor, who covers the Chiefs for The Athletic, by Nate Taylor. He was on Scoop City, one of the Athletics podcasts with Diana Rossini and Chase Daniel. He noted just like, what Andy Reid wants against the Ravens. They're looking for one highlight, Xavier Worthy catching a deep pass. That is the message. That's been the note out of camp all August, like all summer really, that the Chiefs want to get back to throwing the ball down the field. They want to be an offense that can attack vertically. Mahomes has said that in a recent interview with Chris Sims. That's just been the message. And obviously getting Xavier Worthy, the fastest player to ever run the 40 at the combine, that's kind of in line with that. But, just my personal evaluation, Sal, I don't know that he's not really a downfield ball winner, right? They're going to have to scheme him into situations where he's not seeing press coverage, where he's ripping through kind of the heart of the defense. I just wonder how that aligns with, now you're probably looking at Justin Watson as the X receiver as opposed to Marquise Brown. Rashee Rice is still a guy that you want to scheme up touches underneath. So I agree with Nate. They're probably hunting for that deep strike. I just wonder exactly how it's going to come. And like you said, against a defense that lost some players, lost some personnel, obviously lost Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator, but still is probably going to be one of the best units in the league.
Yeah, and I think one way that you might be able to see it is just in the trenches with the Chiefs probably having an advantage in this game. Still have a really strong offensive line. Joe Thuney holding it down there. Creed Humphrey in the middle of that line. So yeah, I think that's probably where it comes. Just Patrick Mahomes with time, with a fast receiver, long developing routes. Like even if he's just 50% of what Tyreek Hill was in this offense, you can probably get at least 1 or 2 mishaps in a game, or at least opportunities.
Last thing I wanted to talk about here, Jaylen Warren, who had a hamstring injury for the bulk of the last few weeks. He practiced on Monday. He's expected to play in week 1 against the Falcons. I just want to throw this out there, Sal, for purely my own benefit and kind of hear how you're looking at Jaylen Warren this year, because I thought Jaylen Warren was one of the biggest values in fantasy prior to August, like in very early drafts. I for the most part, had him ranked ahead of Najee Harris as the top back in this offense, because he can catch passes and he can play on critical downs. And I think he's just the more efficient rusher. They're different backs, totally understand that, but I think he's the more efficient rusher. He has been so far through their NFL careers. He was never going to fully stiff arm Najee Harris to the side. Harris is a pretty good back in his own right, but still, I think there's a chance that he could be the lead dog of this committee backfield, this team that clearly wants to run the football. Then he picks up this injury, and I never like to draft into injuries. I did dock Jaylen Warren in my rankings, but if he's going to play in week 1 and he's going to kind of be a full go, I think he could end up being he could go down as one of the biggest values then in August, because obviously his ADP dropped alongside with this injury.
Yeah, ADP dropped almost a round. He started creeping into this late 7th round, and I was like, okay, I still like him here. And then falls into the late 8th, early 9th because of this injury. He suffered the injury 23 days before the Steelers' first game. This hamstring injury, since it's not a tear, it's probably a 2 to 3 week recovery, a mild hamstring, which is right in line with where we're at. Maybe week 1 he's limited. That would make sense just coming off of something like that. So for the first week of the season, he looks like a flex option, at best, around a top 36 running back. But moving forward after that, I feel really good about it. It could be a buy low opportunity if he only gets 8 touches week 1 because of that injury for him. I'm still in on Jaylen Warren, expecting a limited role, but for the season, fully in.
Yeah. early season returns for him, I think, will be important. He's going to be one of those big reveals that I'm looking for in week one. What is the backfield split look like between Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris? And like you said, it could be a little more limited for Warren just because he's coming off an injury, but that's certainly going to be one of the things I'm tracking in week one. That's a perfect transition, Sal, to get us into our data dump segments because a lot of my data dumps here from heading into week one are on the theme of these big reveals. Let's get into that right after this first break. All right, welcome to our data dump for week one.
Yes, science.
My calculations are correct. You're going to see some serious.
So like I said prior to the break, Sal, all of my kind of data dumps here, and we'll lead with mine and then we'll come to yours next. I tried to go big picture here. I tried to go big reveals. Shout out to my old buddy Sigmund Bloom, like big reveals from week one, things that we come out and we see this team or this player or this just offense overall, like what they look like in week one could really change our rest of season rankings and projections. So I wanted to start this off with the team that I've been talking about being very curious about seeing in the early season and sort of the molding of two worlds here. The Eagles. My first stat for this show, the Eagles ranked dead last in dropbacks under center in each of the last two seasons, and they were third in 2021. Obviously, all of those are Jalen Hurts' years starting for the Philadelphia Eagles, being the full-time guy. And in 21, it was kind of like a figuring out period between Nick Sirianni and Shane Steichen and Jalen Hurts. But the offense the last 2 years has been pretty much unlike most other offenses in the NFL and just how college RPO heavy shotgun it was. Meanwhile, Kellen Moore's Cowboys, I kind of threw out the Chargers last year just because it was a season that went really awry really quickly. But Kellen Moore's Cowboys were 10th and 7th in 2021 and 2022 in dropbacks under center. So I'm very curious, Sal, just to see what this Eagles offense looks like because we'll see how much Kellen Moore is going to be asked to adjust to Jalen Hurts, and then vice versa. How much is Jalen Hurts going to be asked to adjust to an offense that on paper is unlike anything that he's played in the NFL so far?
Yeah, all the preseason reports make it seem like it's the best Jalen Hurts you've ever seen. They're working great together. We'll see when it hits the field in week one. But yeah, I mean, adding a little bit more deception, I think would do wonders for an offense in Philadelphia that even at times last year, second half of the season, Hurts was banged up and injured a little bit, but it seemed like it was falling apart, getting a little bit stagnant. Maybe this just is a wrinkle in a way to add more deception, especially if Kellen Moore not only brings up that rate, but also pre-snap motion, moving
right.
A.J. Brown around the formation, which is something that really hasn't been locked in Philadelphia yet. And the guy is already putting up massive production these 1,400-yard seasons. Adding Saquon Barkley into that mix in the backfield with Jalen Hurts, which if you give Saquon Barkley just a little bit of an extra step, if you're going to go more out of shotgun, on some of these linebackers with the threat of Jalen Hurts keeping the ball and running, that can take a whole different route for the offense as well. So it'll be interesting. Week one is something definitely to look at is how this Eagles offense operates under Kellen Moore now, and that could be a massive piece.
Yeah, and the Packers defense, their opponent in week one in the Friday night Brazil game, that's a defense that's under a bit of its transition in its own right as well. They're moving away from Joe Barry as a defensive coordinator there, so we don't quite know what that's going to look like, although Jeff Hafley's traditionally been a cover one kind of man coverage heavy team at college. Is that going to continue in the pros? We'll see about that. I think that's going to be a matchup I really want to dial into because, look, I mean, Jalen Hurts is a fantasy starter, A.J. Brown's a fantasy starter, Devontae Smith, all these guys, you're probably starting them every single week on your fantasy team. So is it going to move the needle that much in deciding whether these guys are fantasy starters? No, but there is just league wrecking upside for all of these players if Jalen Hurts can handle this offensive transition, because I think he's the question mark. Hurts is a good quarterback, but he's just been in a very singular environment, and there are things I think he's not shown that he can do so far at the NFL level. Is it because he's not been asked to do them, or is it because he can't do them? That's the central question here, because if he can do them, I mean, yeah, A.J. Brown can be the wide receiver one overall. Devontae Smith, I think, could be a back half wide receiver one. Saquon Barkley, like you said, and if this offensive environment comes together to score a lot of points, he could be a top 5 running back in fantasy. There's a definite floor for all of those players available as well. But that week one big reveal, Sal, I think is one of the ones I'm most looking forward to. Did you end up with any of these guys like in your drafts a lot? Because I definitely, when I got like a back half first round pick, I felt pretty good about falling backwards into A.J. Brown there.
Yeah, I have one draft where I got A.J. Brown, I think, at the 10th pick. And then I had a draft where I got Saquon, like middle to late of the second, basically where he goes and how that draft went. I think I had a wide receiver first round, just secure a running back. So I feel good about these guys. And it's almost interesting. Like, it's funny. Jalen Hurts, at least from a fantasy perspective, he has such a safe and locked in floor. And if it hits this explosive upside that you're talking about, I mean, it could be number one quarterback season ever. So like you get that safe floor of like, yeah, he's probably going to be a top 5 quarterback if he stays healthy, maybe top 2. And then there's just this massive ceiling that comes with it, which is pretty rare for a player.
Right. Like he could play poorly and be a top 5 fantasy quarterback. He could have a season where the Eagles are coming away at the end of it like, we don't want to say it publicly, but we maybe regret that contract a little bit. And he could still go down as a great fantasy pick, which is just the boost of that rushing floor and ceiling as we're talking about. Okay, my second one here. Geno Smith's passer rating by down in 2023. First down, 96.3. Second down, 106.3. Third down, 72.7. Fourth down, 39.6. By the way, in 2022, on late downs, third and fourth down, he had a 99.6 passer rating on average. This is interesting, Sal, because I think this is really the crux of what went wrong with the Seahawks offense last year, is they just couldn't pass protect on late downs. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Like those receivers were as good as advertised, even if Tyler Lockett fell back a little bit, I think last year. And I still think Geno played like a fringe top 10 type of quarterback. They just had injuries at both tackle spots. Abe Lucas especially had a problematic season from a time miss perspective, and he's a question mark running into this year as well. I don't know if they fixed this offensive line, but if they did, and if the system helps them fix the offensive line a little bit too, that was another thing. We all harped on the Eagles for not having answers against pressure, especially against the blitz, but I don't think the Seahawks had great answers for it last year either, other than Geno Smith get the ball out really, really quick, especially on late downs, which then you're taking away explosive play potential. So I say all this to say that I think this is going to be a big week 1 reveal, and they actually have a pretty good matchup to pass protect well. The Broncos were bottom 7 at pressure rate last year.
Yeah, when you put out those numbers just in terms of his pass rating, it's all pass protection on those late downs, obvious passing situations. And honestly, like just personnel on the line doesn't give me much confidence. They actually lose Damian Lewis. They lose Evan Brown, their interior. They bring in guys to replace him, of course, but they have to now gel with this line. They lose Will Dissly, who's a great blocker, a tight end. That was a piece of that offense. But like you mentioned, I think their solve for this, at least if I'm the coaching staff seeing your personnel, is, okay, we're just going to spread it out more. Like that's what our offensive coordinator wants to do, Ryan Grubb. And that hopefully will be the answer in obvious passing down situations. That's at least the way that I see it right now, based on the personnel that they're seeing. Christian Hayes, a middle round rookie guard, was taken in replacement. They bring in George Fant, Laken Tomlinson. Like these are not the pieces that are going to upgrade your line as much as probably the system will just help mitigate some of those issues.
Right, and this could almost end up being a trap, maybe, where in the first 2 weeks they get the Broncos, like I said, in week 1. In week 2, they get the Patriots. Week 3, they get the Dolphins. Week 4, the Lions. Week 5, really against a pass rush that I think is going to end up being pretty ferocious this year in the New York Giants with Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau, and especially Dexter Lawrence. That could end up being the real test here, because I think those first 3 weeks, and even week 4 with Aiden Hutchinson, maybe that's a pretty big test as well. That's a ABC ESPN game, so that'll be a public. That's probably actually the big test. Like first 3 weeks, we'll see. I think week 4, then we'll get some final answers on whether the Seahawks offense is going to be able to push it forward. Because, like I said, man, Sal, these are all really good players. Like I think JSN is going to take a huge leap in year 2. I think DK Metcalf is still really good. Geno's a quality quarterback. Like it just all comes down to pass protection, which is a boring answer, but I think it's the answer for this particular offense. I'll move to point number 3 here. Another offense I can't wait to see in week 1, and I just used this stat to sort of talk about all of these players. Colts first read target share in weeks 1 to 3, which is the games that Anthony Richardson started and mostly finished. He played over 90% of the snaps in both those 2 games. This comes from Fantasy Points data. Michael Pittman, 32.8%. It was pretty much right in line with his 35.7% for the whole season. Josh Downs, 22.4%. Kylan Granson, the tight end, 15.5%. And Alec Pierce, 12.1%. I just kind of wanted to use this again to talk about the Colts, because how is Anthony Richardson and what this Colts offense looks like not one of the biggest reveals in week 1, Sal? And it's similar to what we just talked about with Jalen Hurts. I think Richardson could have maybe not a poor season by his standards, but he could have like a fine season and still be a great fantasy quarterback. But I think there's a really high ceiling for this offense available because Pittman's a good player. Downs, when he's healthy, I'm such a Josh Downs fan. I love his game. And A.D. Mitchell, I think, has a potential to be a transformative figure in this offense because of the skill set he brings and how he will upgrade that vertical X receiver spot.
Yeah, Richardson, I think a lot of worries came after that preseason game where he actually had a pretty solid first drive and then he throws the pick six. And now there's been tons of worries. And for real life, obviously, that's an issue if you're a fan base and you want to see what it looks like. But like you said, for fantasy, I think okay, if it made him fall around in fantasy drafts, fine. I think even if he throws a pick six every other game, maybe not that much, but he's still going to be on the field, the capital they have in this guy, and he's going to be producing. In terms of the target shares, yeah, I think it makes sense. I think they want to work through Michael Pittman. I think they now actually have the personnel with an Adonai Mitchell, like you said, to stretch the field in maybe a more efficient and effective way or dynamic way than an Alec Pierce. So when I see the Alec Pierce lower target share from last year, I don't think that's anything in terms of what Anthony Richardson could or could not do when throwing to the outside. I think we know what his arm can do. I think now with an Adonai Mitchell there, if you can get some more separation downfield or just the threat of that separation, it can open some things up for this offense.
Yeah, and the fact that I think they really believe once they got Mitchell in the building, or at least this is what I've heard from people, that they were even kind of blown away by what he was and what he was able to do, because they talked about him as kind of that, kind of that vertical X receiver and his ability to separate on downfield routes. But then when Downs went down, he got injured. They threw A.D. Mitchell into the slot. They used him in a variety of different alignments, which I think just goes to show the confidence they have in him as a player. I really don't know what this week one target share is going to look like. I don't even know if Josh Downs is going to play in this game, which is a huge variable as well. But seeing Adonai Mitchell's role, and if he's a every down player, if he's doing more than just sacrificial X receiver stuff like Alec Pierce was doing last year, I feel like nobody logged more real life miles run last year and fewer targets from a ratio perspective than Alec Pierce. I don't think that's going to be A.D. Mitchell's role. He could end up being a guy that, I don't even know what I'm sure you probably know off the top of your head, his roster percentage or where he's at right now across all these platforms. He could be a guy that leads week one waiver articles, especially if in conjunction to that, Anthony Richardson plays well against the Texans, a team everybody's behind this year.
Yeah, as of 2 days ago, he's available in 70% of Yahoo leagues. Outside of maybe a Khalil Shakur, who's right around that 50% mark, he's probably the number one pickup, especially when you're talking about just pure ceiling. We know what Michael Pittman is, and he's going to be a good receiver, earn his target share. But if you're talking about pure ceiling on a per catch basis, that's what you're going to get in Adonai Mitchell.
See, I knew Sal was going to have that right off the top of his head, man. That's why you're on this show. All right, moving to point number 4. Kirk Cousins, 123.7 passer rating versus man coverage, ranked second among quarterbacks to start 8+ games in 2023, and third best versus single high was his passer rating last year, again, among players to start 8+ games at quarterback. This makes sense because, or at least this lines up with their week one opponent, because the Steelers played the 7th highest rate of man coverage last year and the 4th highest rate of single high, according to fantasy points data. And I know people will be like, well, Justin Jefferson last year. You got to remember, he didn't have Justin Jefferson for all those games. Jefferson missed time. So I think this is interesting. And also, if you look back at his 22 season, some of these stats hold up as well. The Steelers are a defense that I really like watching, Sal, because they play man coverage. They beat you up. Joey Porter Jr. will whoop your ass at the line of scrimmage. He's a fun cornerback there. But man, I think that, again, in the theme of big reveals, if Kirk Cousins plays pretty well against this man-heavy defense, if Drake London, who's a guy that can both separate against man coverage and can also win jump balls against man coverage as well, if those two guys come out and have a big week one, look, everybody's already high on the Falcons. We took these guys like Drake London and Bijan Robinson very high in fantasy drafts. But if Kirk's matchup numbers against man coverage hold in week one, he has a big week one game, they beat up on a really good defense, I think that will just increase the enthusiasm around some of these Falcons players.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we can just assume, and this is a big assumption, that the Achilles is going to be fine. It's not going to be
very big assumption, but yeah.
Yes, yeah. As long as it's probably more so mental for Kirk Cousins just to be out there, assuming that's all good and he's through that. It's a great matchup. Like the matchup is really good in this situation. You talk about all the man coverage stuff. He's going to have time behind this Falcons offensive line. You have Chris Lindstrom holding it down. They gave him an extension. So I think there's week one, all of the second round Drake London picks, all of the fifth or sixth round Kyle Pitts. I think it's going to pay off probably right away, just assuming that Kirk Cousins still looks like himself when he was leading the NFL in passing before getting injured last year.
Yeah, and it's, again, an interesting one that maybe because of this matchup, maybe week one ends up being a mirage, but they get the Eagles in the next game in week 2, the Chiefs in week 3, the Saints in week 4. That's even not a pushover defense. But so I think this could end up maybe being a little bit of and it's, Falcons revenge game against Arthur Smith, who's the offensive coordinator now for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But maybe because of this, again, like I said, it ends up being a bit of a mirage, but it's a great way if you're a team like the Falcons that has so much new, right? New head coach, new play caller, new quarterback. If all that coalesces into like a big week one performance, I think, again, that's going to make you feel pretty good about drafting some of these players. Whereas on the inverse, if it doesn't look great in week one, you could be feeling a little bit, concerned about some of these players you took early on. Okay. Last one I have here, number 5, data dump point for me is Chris Godwin's slot rate by season. This is per PFF. Last year, 2023, 37%, 2022, 72.9%, 2021, 70.4%, 2020, 66.9%, and 2019, 63.4%. Spot the outlier there, everybody. It was clearly last year lining up in the slot on 37% of his routes. I love Chris Godwin as a player. He was one of like my original RP guys when I started charting college prospects. I think he's just kind of had some bad luck the last 2 years. The torn ACL, rough comeback from that in 2022. Last year, he had a good season. I think Chris Godwin played well. He just didn't score a lot of touchdowns. And I think some of that was because, Mike Evans and Baker Mayfield were running hot. I think that, he obviously was playing a little bit out of position. He's a guy that can win on the outside, but I think is truly maximized as that big power slot receiver, which is what he was in Bruce Arians' offense and probably what he's going to be again in Liam Cohen's offense. The Bucs have a cakewalk matchup in week 1 against Washington, who it's a new staff. There's a lot of new players here. They gave up 80.3 yards per game to slot receivers, which is top half in the league. And then second most in the league, 131.7 yards per game to outside wide receivers. So, it could definitely just be the Mike Evans show for sure again. But I don't know, Sal, I like Mike Evans. I ranked him really highly this year, but I also ranked Chris Godwin pretty highly this year too. I think there's like a non-0% chance that Chris Godwin, if he just has some better touchdown luck, can actually be the top scoring Bucs receiver. But obviously still, again, I'm in on Mike Evans. But this is a pretty big, and I think kind of under the radar, big reveal in week 1, Chris Godwin's role.
Yeah, and this is one that it's a teaser for the article coming out on Yahoo later in the week. In my matchups to exploit, Chris Godwin looks phenomenal against this Commanders team, assuming that he does go into the slot more, like we saw the small sample in the preseason. Now, it might not be that simple, like to take a strong man argument here. You could be like, okay, well, those other years, he was obviously younger. Some of those before an injury, a different offense, a different quarterback. It's not Baker Mayfield who likes to make those throws to the outside to Mike Evans, but it's at least worth trying. Like Liam Cohen is going to be putting him back into the slot. He's seen something in camp to get excited about putting him back into the slot. So I think that this is going to be week 1 is going to tell a lot, like you said. I think it's the perfect matchup. The Commanders lost pieces in their secondary. Already wasn't a great unit last year. They lose Fuller this offseason, probably their best cornerback. Didn't really replace him much. This should be a spot right away where we see just upside, in my opinion, for Chris Godwin, who had the same amount of targets basically as Mike Evans last year. You change that now with a little bit more touchdowns, maybe more yards after the catch since he's operating out of the slot, and you can get back to a top 20 wide receiver season. Yeah,
and what's interesting too, you mentioned he was a younger player back then. You'd almost think that a guy who's coming off a serious injury and is maybe lost a little bit of juice from that ACL tear and kind of a complicated recovery there, you'd almost rather than put him in the slot, right? Like you'd rather do that to make his life easier, not move him to the outside. I think if there's a few nits you could pick at the Bucs offense last year, even though I generally think Dave Canales has the right ideas, this would be one of them. I'd also point out too that when you look at some of those big Chris Godwin seasons like 2019 and 2020, in terms of reception perception charting, he ran 20.9% of his routes was an out route in 2019, 10.6% out route rate in 2020. Both of those are above the NFL average. And those are the routes, like you mentioned, Mike Evans, he ran more out routes last year than ever because that's what Baker Mayfield likes to do. He likes to push the ball deep and outside the numbers. He's not a middle of the field reader. So if you can get some route combinations with maybe Jalen McMillan as your flanker and Chris Godwin as your slot running out breaking routes, we can get some big plays, I think, back in Chris Godwin's article. So rather quiet one, but I do think that's a pretty big week one reveal that I'm looking to see. All right, let's throw it to another break here. When we get back, we'll get Sal's 5 stats that you need to know heading into week one right after this. All right, Sal, we're back. Hit me with your first stat that the people need to know heading into week one.
Yeah, it's going to center around this Rams defense that is without Aaron Donald for the first time in forever against a Lions offense. And obviously for fantasy, it's not as much about the defense as it is of what's going to be happening for that Lions offense in a beneficial spot. I think the Lions offense outclasses them everywhere in this one. You talk about the secondary, they bring in Tre'Davious White. And this is for the Rams. He's still just 29 years old, but not the same player since that injury. And then they have Darius Williams they're bringing back. Solid season last year, but they're pretty thin at the position. And those are your starters. Like those are your best guys. Obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're starting. Even in like prop markets, I think his line's 87.5. All of this looks fantastic. This could be the Jameson Williams game right away. If you took him in round 9, round 10, you're probably starting him in the flex this week because it's a perfect matchup for him on the outside against those cornerbacks. And the spot that I really like, I mentioned Aaron Donald, is going to be in the interior running the ball this week against the probably number one, according to PFF, at least entering the season, Lions offensive line against this Aaron Donald-less defensive line with a lot of questions of the Rams. Jahmyr Gibbs coming off the hamstring injury. He'll play. You're starting him, but I do think he could be limited even 10 to 20%, which makes David Montgomery an even better start this week. A must start in my opinion. And then if he has a good game, which he sets up nicely here for, that's when you can try and sell high on him before Gibbs takes back his full role. So this is the spot that I'm looking at. I think it's the biggest mismatch offensive versus defensive line in week one.
Great call. Love this one. The Lions actually opened with 28 implied points, the highest of the week for week number one here. Makes complete sense because this offense rocks. They didn't really lose much. They're probably getting more contributions from Jameson Williams this year than they ever have before, which pretty low bar, by the way. It's not like he didn't do much until the end of last season, but they're probably getting a full season's worth of contributions from him. The only negative is that Jahmyr Gibbs is a little banged up heading into week one, or he's coming off of an injury, which I think leads to your point about David Montgomery. Like if you're breaking ties in favor of a low-end running back 2 or like a flex play, I think Montgomery makes a ton of sense there because if they're implied to score the most points on the week, according to Vegas, David Montgomery's going to get in the mix there. We know he's the goal line back. That role will probably remain the same. I love this call here. I think that, when you look at just, again, the entire slate here, they're I'm with you, one of the biggest mismatches here and a team that could score a ton of points in week one.
Yeah, and I think that takes me into my second stat, which I don't know if it's going to be a team that can score a bunch of points, but if we get that tell week one from the Carolina Panthers offense, because the number is 4.1, that's their yards per play last year, dead last in the NFL, pretty close to by far dead last. Like not many teams even close to that. If you're under 4.5, it's rough, and they were almost under 4, but they made a lot of moves this offseason. We've talked about it a lot during the summer. If you weren't with us during that time, they bring in a new coach, Dave Canales. He's revived some past offenses the last few years in Seattle and in Tampa Bay. They bring in offensive line help, which could help in the interior. They get Robert Hunt, they sign him to a big deal. Damian Lewis from the Seahawks, they sign him to a big deal. So the interior is kind of bolstered up for Bryce Young, who was up there in terms of his pressure rate last year. And week one, matchup against the Saints defensive line is pretty good. Like they're not the defensive line they used to be a couple of years ago. Solid secondary, but Bryce Young should have more time to throw with Deontay Johnson, a new weapon, with potentially Xavier Legette factoring in a new weapon. Adam Thielen's still there. If we see it week one at all, if we see this offense looking better, which is all the reports out of camp, it's more creative, then I think you can start buying into Deontay is a weekly starter in fantasy. Chuba Hubbard, while Jonathan Brooks is out, is a weekly starter in fantasy if we can just see this week one against a pretty solid Saints secondary.
This is 4.1. You're right. It's so low. Not only was it the lowest last year, the lowest in 2022 was the Houston Texans at 4.7. The lowest in 2021 was, ironically, the Carolina Panthers at 4.6. And then in 2020, the lowest was the New York Jets at 4.7. So not only were they the lowest by a lot last year, they're the worst offense we've seen over the last 4 years in the NFL. So yeah, almost, Sal, regardless of how you feel about Bryce Young, like whether he's ever going to be worth the number one pick or whatever, like it's going to be better than it was last season, almost just by default. Like they can get up to 4.7 yards per play, still maybe be a bottom 5 team in the league and be better than it was last season. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to the wide receivers. I'm a big Deontay Johnson fan. Sal, I mentioned on the Bold Predictions show yesterday with Andy Behrens on the feed. Like, I do think being a wide receiver 1 is within Deontay's range of outcomes because he's an elite separator, mistake-prone player, but he is an elite separator. He earns a lot of targets. And yeah, Sal, like if Bryce Young is the 28th best quarterback in the league, that's a huge improvement from what we saw last year. And we've seen Deontay Johnson have fringe wide receiver 1 seasons with bad quarterbacks. And I don't think Bryce Young is going to be a bad quarterback this year. I think he'll be closer to like a league average quarterback. But for all of this to come true, what else do we need to see if the upside case is present for Deontay Johnson? And I guess the upside of being the 15th best quarterback is present for Bryce Young.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to see the improvement from Bryce Young, which all of this is the goal. And I think the biggest thing is just time to throw. Like last year, as somebody who admittedly bet too often on the overs of Bryce Young's completions, which were set at, 16 and a half, 17 and a half towards the end of the season. So I was watching these games. That dude had no time to throw. He was not throwing the ball because, they just don't trust the guy. They don't want him throwing downfield. Part of it was the personnel and weapons to stretch the field. The other part was anytime he would drop back, he legitimately had 2 seconds to throw the ball, and you're not going to have any plays develop at that point. So I do think the offensive line additions will help. We'll see. It's the interior. It's not the tackles that got a big upgrade, which is a little bit of a concern still. But I do think it's going to make a difference.
Man, you're one sick puppy. I'll tell you that. You're betting
sure
like the overs. You're the overs on Bryce Young completions and actually watching Panthers games.
Yeah, in week 17.
Oh, by the way, in week 17 he had 19 completions. That was one of his better games. But
cash that. Cash that.
Yeah, great. The next week, 11 completions against the Bucs.
We gave it all back.
0 points. 0 points did the Carolina Panthers in that particular game. So
that'll happen.
Yeah, man. That'll happen. So I really do think, though, this offense can go from being historically bad to functional. And that would be great for a guy like Deontay Johnson. I think he could end up being one of those big risers out of week 1. And I say that as a guy who's been a long time Deontay Johnson backer. So my bias is all admitted in this particular equation here. Let's go to your third one here with a team that's slightly better than the Carolina Panthers.
Yes, I'm going with, slightly better is a good way to put it. The Bills' O-line and James Cook against this Arizona Cardinals defensive line. PFF has this Arizona Cardinals defensive line ranked preseason heading into the year dead last, 32nd in the entire NFL. And this Bills offense is projected for 27 points this week. You mentioned the Lions 28 and a half. They're number 1. The Bills are projected to score the second most points as of right now on the week. So there's a lot of concerns about what this Bills offense is going to look like without Stephon Diggs, now entering the first full season under Joe Brady at offensive coordinator. How's it all going to look? New personnel at wide receiver. I think it's going to be fine. Definitely this week is what Vegas thinks it's going to be fine. And I think James Cook could play a big role in that. A guy who's coming off of a nearly 1,600 total yard season last year. Just didn't get it done in terms of scoring touchdowns because Josh Allen was scoring all of them around the goal line. But this matchup, 27 points are implied as a 6-point favorite. It sets up nicely for all the offensive pieces here. Khalil Shakur, if he's still on waivers, I think you can flex him if you need to, if you're battling some sort of wide receiver injury early. But definitely James Cook. I think he's a top 10 running back for this week specifically. And I wouldn't be shocked if he finishes as the RB1 overall in the week.
Oh, I love that call. Because what a lot of people, as we spent all offseason kind of talking about the pass catchers and no Stephon Diggs and all that, really what got lost in the back half of the Bills' offensive kind of, transformation a little bit was that they really committed to being a power run team, and not just like we run the ball well, like literally they were one of the most efficient man gap run teams at the end of the season. They ran a ton of duo. They ran like James Cook, a smaller back, but got explosive plays on man gap runs because it just helps him see things and hit it and be explosive because he is that guy. And for as much, I love the Cardinals offense this year. I won't say I love the Cardinals offense. I'm not Nate Tice, but I really like the Cardinals offense, and I'm excited about a lot of these players. But that enthusiasm completely goes out the door when you just flip over to the other side of the depth chart page, which is the defense. That is still a unit that is in complete transition. So, yeah, I think that James Cook is set up really well here. I love that. I also think that the Cardinals offense then on the other side could be set to chase and put up a lot of points, maybe in catch-up mode and things like that. So if you're kind of breaking ties in favor of some Cardinals, I think that can be the story you tell yourself. Before we move off the Bills here, I know I said we spent way too much time obsessing about the pass catchers, but I'm going to ask you about the pass catchers here before we get off the Bills. Week 1, sort of route distribution, route deployment. How do you expect this wide receiver room to look in week 1?
Yeah, we got to see what happens with Curtis Samuel, like just battling from an injury, if there's going to be any limitations around that when he comes back into play. I'm expecting it to be Khalil Shakur and a Keon Coleman in terms of overall usage for week 1. Now, for the whole season, I like taking stabs on Keon Coleman in fantasy drafts when he was a 10th round pick, see what the upside could look like. They're going to have to just, in some regards, feed him the ball more than usual, just how many vacated targets are there, where they spent the draft capital on him. But for week 1, Khalil Shakur is my favorite receiver. He's healthy compared to Curtis Samuel. He's somebody who's available, like I said, in nearly 50% of Yahoo leagues right now. And this was a guy who when he was targeted last year, was highly efficient in the offense.
Yeah.
He had over 15 PPR points per game last year in 42% of his games. And he didn't even start to play a lot until Joe Brady took over. And now Stephon Diggs is gone. Now Gabe Davis is gone. I think that he could run 32 routes in this game as a 27-point team total. That's really appealing.
Yeah, Khalil Shakur is a good player. He was one of my favorite draft sleepers when he was coming out that year. I thought he went way too late in the 5th round. I thought he was more of like a 3rd round pick. And he's played well when called upon. And since Curtis Samuel was far and away my favorite Bills receiver this offseason, but since he's been injured a little bit, I've come lower on him and risen up Khalil Shakur. So I think Shakur probably leads the team in routes run in week 1 would be my guess. And then my other guess is that Mac Hollins is going to run more routes than people want in week 1. That's my other prediction there on these Bills wide receivers. But otherwise, I'm mostly in line with a lot of what you said there. I will say I'm tracking Keon Coleman's week 1 role and just kind of how much they put on his plate. Speaking of rookie wide receivers, that's what you've got here for your 4th point that people need to know.
Yeah, Malik Neighbors, the 6th overall pick in the draft from the New York Giants. He gets a great matchup week 1 against a concerning Vikings secondary. And really, it's just been an unfortunate offseason for the Vikings secondary. Their first day of camp, they lose Mekhi Becton to a torn ACL. I think it was the 2nd or 3rd day of camp. Shaq Griffin has a hamstring injury that he should be at this point back from, but still, that's something that sets you back. They cut Louis Cine, their 2022 first-round pick, another piece of their secondary that they wish that they could have had. They lose Kyrie Jackson to a tragic car accident in the offseason. Like, this is everything for this secondary. Hasn't been great in the offseason. They've had a lot of setbacks. They need more time and resources. It's just plain and put what this secondary needs entering week 1, but they don't have it because week 1 is now here, and they're going to get Malik Neighbors coming to town. Like the rest of the Giants offense, and when you're looking at it overall, like, yeah, okay, we're not too concerned if we're the Vikings defense. There's just this one guy for the most part that we have to pay attention to, but that one guy is probably going to see like a 30+% target share in week 1. He's somebody that no matter what format you're playing in, you're going to be starting him as a 4th or a 5th round pick. But I think that he actually has number 1 wide receiver overall upside this week. I think he has just top 12 for sure. He's going to rank right around that range in a solid matchup against a secondary that's just still trying to figure things out. They're still trying to plug guys in, signing guys as recent as last week. I think that's going to be an advantage. Even if Daniel Jones is not efficient, you can overcome that when you're seeing a 8 to 10 plus target game.
I'm so fascinated by this matchup for Malik Neighbors because I think there's going to be a lot of like discourse about it coming out of it because, well, number one, he was like one of the most discussed players. It felt like everybody's talking about Malik Neighbors a ton, training camp highlights and into the preseason, all this stuff. And the Vikings defense, it was so fun to watch, but it was also very weird last year. They lead the NFL by a lot in cover 0. They just threw a lot at quarterbacks. They would blitz and then play coverage as opposed to like blitzing and then play man. They would drop guys back. It was a very interesting defense. It was very much like what you do if you're Brian Flores when you know you don't have good players. And I say that with all respect to the players that played last year, but they were undermanned personnel wise on the defense. And it was a huge transition from whatever they did the year prior under Ed Donatel. Like Daniel Jones tearing up that defense in the playoffs a couple years ago means nothing because it was a completely different system, a lot of different players, and certainly the fact of what Flores did last year. Like what Flores did last year it's like kills bad quarterbacks. It really puts bad quarterbacks in the blender. So as much like we know Malik Neighbors is good and we know Malik Neighbors, is going to do his job. My concern mostly this, Sal, is like, what does Daniel Jones look like against this Vikings defense? And how much does the Vikings defense change? Which you're right. The two guys that are set to start at cornerback is, Stephon Gilmore, who is an older player, and Shaquille Griffin, who's bounced around, but at least he can run. That's kind of their logic there. And Gilmore is a guy who played a lot of man coverage last year under Dan Quinn in Dallas. And is he equipped to do that? And this defense is not really what they did last year. It'd be interesting to watch those two guys. But so yeah, that's the Malik Neighbors side of it. To me, it's more of Daniel Jones versus this front, and can he survive back there?
That's the thing, is the front. Like, is the offensive line going to give him time? An offensive line that was, just brutal last year in terms of giving their quarterbacks time to throw. A lot has, they brought in a couple of pieces, but for the most part, not much has changed. Like, they're just hoping Andrew Thomas gets healthy and trying to get anything else from the other pieces on this unit. If Evan Neal can contribute at all this year, that would obviously be a massive step forward, a former first-round pick. So yeah, does Daniel Jones have time? And reading defenses is another concern too, but I'm going to bet on the probably 30+% target share from Malik Neighbors, because the matchup advantage for him, at least when they're in man coverage for those points of the game, is going to be massive.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not just a continuation of the preseason when he was like, yeah, I can do my job and get the ball, but the ball's got to, go, or a lot of things have to go right for me to get the ball, basically. Hopefully it's not a continuation of that. Hopefully he can get the ball here in week number 1. Sal, give me your fifth and final note of stat that the people need to know headed into week 1.
Yeah, the Raiders tight ends, and I say tight ends because there's two good ones there, against the Chargers linebackers this week. You're going to be having the first-round pick, Brock Bowers. A lot of discourse when he got taken to this team, since they already had a second-round pick from a year before, Michael Mayer. This is the guy who caught 50-plus balls 3 straight years in college. He's great, and he's going to be going up right away in his first game ever against these Chargers linebackers that, honestly, there's not too much there. Like, Denzel Perriman used to be on this team years ago. They bring him back off of maybe his career worst year when he was with the Jaguars last year. Then they're probably going to be starting a rookie in Junior Colson. So there's a lot of question marks from these linebackers. And that's a spot where Brock Bowers, who is a very intelligent tight end when it comes to just reading coverages, knowing where to be, he can take advantage of that if there's question marks in your defense. So there's been talks, is he a top 15 tight end for fantasy this year? Where are you drafting him? I think week 1 you're starting him, assuming you just didn't get an elite tight end early on, because this matchup is that good.
And I think over the long term, the Chargers defense is going to be better than it was under Brandon Staley. I think Jesse Minter, who comes with Jim Harbaugh from Michigan, I think they're going to be kind of the right ideas that you want to see from a modern NFL defense. They're going to be more in line with the league's meta, all of that stuff. But it might take some time. It took time when Mike McDonald came from Michigan to Baltimore. It took time for that defense to coalesce, and they had much better players. Right? They're much, much better players in Baltimore. I think the defense will eventually turn around. I think the offense in Los Angeles could be a little bit underrated to start. So that'll be interesting just to see that offensive defensive matchup. But your note about Brock Bowers and these guys against the Chargers linebackers is really good. So people probably aren't starting Michael Mayer in fantasy or anything like that, but I wonder if he could end up just getting better usage in week 1 than we think, and maybe he's a waiver wire guy, maybe he's a prop bet guy. I don't know. How do we use that in week 1, I guess?
Well, I think that their base offense could just be both these guys on the field if they want to run the ball. And this is a game that I think maybe it's a 3-point spread. It might have been a 1-point spread. Either way, it's a close game where both teams are going to want to run the ball. So in general, it's just gross for fantasy production and overall yardage. But Michael Mayer, at least in 2 tight end sets, should be on the field a little bit more. I don't know how many lines will be out there for his receiving yards, but if they're somewhere in the low to mid 20s, maybe upper 20s, that's something that's appealing in this matchup.
Yeah, Chargers are 3-point home favorites right now, so that makes a lot of sense to me. Both those teams will be fascinating to watch in week 1. Okay, so those are our 10 stats you need to know heading into week 1 here on Data Dump Wednesday. But Sal, let's finish this off with your moves to make segment. Like I said, this is typically going to be a guys to trade for segment, and you're really good at that. I'm not as great at that, so I think it's going to be a huge benefit to the listener. Of course, you're probably not making trades heading into week 1. You drafted the team. Hopefully you like the team. There's one team I drafted this offseason that I accidentally, because sometimes you're in so many slow drafts, Sal. I forgot after a perhaps long night at the Fantasy Football Expo that I had taken Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round of a draft, and I took David Montgomery at a point where I thought he was a value. Maybe that's one team I need to make some pre-week 1 trades because I'm an idiot. But for the rest of the people who aren't idiots out there, you're probably not making week 1 trades. So let's just kind of have a general discussion here, sort of general tips heading into the season for trading in fantasy. I know this is, again, your corner of business.
Yeah, and I'll throw you some bail here. I don't think you're terrible at trades as much as people know that you probably do this for a living. So the second you start to approach them, there's something in it, right? Like you say like I'm so good at trades. I think actually at one point I was like, I would spend a lot of time on this, but now anytime I approach any of my buddies or family members, there's always like, okay, well, what's this guy? What do
you know that I don't know?
They start researching the player's medical history. Like, is something about to expire on this guy? Does he have to get out of the country? Like, everything starts to come up if I try to send a trade offer these days. So it's just hard to get those through. But in terms of the other people listening to this, ideally, if you're in the perfect world, you're not us. You can just go up. There's no background of working in fantasy sports. You can actually get these trades done. Couple of tips. First one is, it's almost like a sales process. Like you want the other person to feel good about the trade that you're starting to engage in. You want to make sure that you come to the table seeing their needs, not just being like, hey, I need this and I want it from you. What are their needs? Look at their roster. If they don't need wide receivers and that's what you're trying to trade for, then there's no point there. So make sure that you understand it. If you want to throw in a couple of nice compliments, like, hey, you did a great job drafting running backs. You have so many. I could use one. Maybe we have a little bit of a deal in the works here. So know the needs of the person you're trying to trade for. And honestly, just go into it with a situation where you want both people to win. That's probably where it's going to be the easiest, and also get future trades done as well if they don't feel like they got gypped in that deal. And the second piece of trade advice is knowing what to look for when you're trying to, you always hear buy low, sell high. Like, what stats should you be looking at? There's usage stats, snaps, routes run, but maybe some of those other stats that your friends don't look at, like unrealized air yards, deep targets in the game and unrealized air yards. They're getting these cheat code targets is what I call them. Deep targets downfield for receivers and tight ends, and red zone targets. If they're getting a lot of those, but they're not paying off, they might eventually start to come through. Same thing for running backs. If they're seeing red zone snaps and touches, and if they're also seeing targets, but they're just not coming through, maybe it was a bad matchup, maybe it was the game script. Those are things that you can look at that'll hold a little bit more sticky moving forward, and you can feel good about that. A couple of years ago, Mike Evans had a great week one. I think this was 2 years ago in terms of unrealized air yards. Not a great fantasy day. That's when I sent the trade offer for a wide receiver who probably overexceeded his week one. It might have been a T. Higgins, and you get a deal done like that. And honestly, in those situations, both people can win depending on your team rosters, but that's some stuff you could be looking for. Final thing I'll say here, and my rant, usually I like to get the best player in the trade. This is more of a general thing. Like, if there's a 2-for-1 deal, and like I said, it could benefit both teams, but I just like to get the talent-wise best player in the trade if I could walk out of that, just as a final closing note.
Okay, I want to quickly hit on that last point before going back to the first one, which is nothing sends me like a faster alarm bell than when someone sends me 3, let's just call them uninspiring pieces for one starter. You know, it's not a number. Okay, it's not like a numbers game. It's like, whoa, man, I get 3 players for one. Because you know what you're going to have to do if you get in the 3 players? You're going to have to cut 2 guys from your roster. And if this joker, this person, being nice when I say person, this person over here is sending you 3 players to try to get one good player, I'm guessing their roster is not that good. So, like, do I even want their 3 players as opposed to cutting 3 of my guys? Also, fantasy's about difference makers, right? Fantasy's about top line starters. I'm not giving you one difference maker for your 3 mid pieces, but that I'm with you on that. That nothing like if I'm getting a trader offer and it's the 3-to-1, no, almost no shot I'm accepting that. Maybe the 2-to-1 if I really have some needs. I need more depth. I need to spread out talent. Maybe, but the 3-to-1 is an immediate, almost auto reject. I don't even need to hear the sales pitch, but it is good that you bring that up in the first point here, Sal, because this is why a lot of fantasy trades don't go down. Is people want to get like they want to one up their league mates. They want to one up their buddies and be like, yeah, I really got the best of that deal. When realistically, this should be something that works for both of you. A great example of that, you see this almost. You see this in a lot of leagues. People always send me screenshots where one guy like hoards league mate holds quarterbacks, right? Like they get 3 of them. Like, well, you know what? Come the end of the draft, buddy, everybody's gonna be coming to me looking for quarterbacks. And guess what? Nobody needs a quarterback, and especially in a 1 quarterback league, you all feel pretty good about your starter down to like all the way to QB 16. So I don't know. I'm with you that that's probably the most important starting point to actually making a good fantasy trade.
Yeah, and also the people who do send those 3-to-1 trades that you talk about, they usually come with a little tag that says this helps you more than it helps me. This is going to help you more than it helps me. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, always. You know, it worked one time. It worked one time, and now it's like, oh, this is my go-to method. It'll work. You throw enough out there, something will stick. Yeah,
just overwhelming me with options and player names, and oh man, look at all these guys again. All right,
Not quite.
Thanks. Not quite. Just give me the one good one. Just give me the one good player. All right, Sal. Well, it's going to be great to get some guys during this segment that people should be trading for, some of those buy low, sell highs. That is going to do it for our first edition of Data Dump Wednesday. Sal, I know you've got some weekly pieces coming to the site. Let the people know what you're working on here as week 1 approaches.
Yeah, a piece went up today on the players that'll decide fantasy championships or kind of impact the season the most, 5 players. And then Thursdays moving forward, there will be a matchup columns for the best running backs, receivers, and tight ends. And Fridays, it'll be a key findings from the week that can just a bunch of stuff in there, whether it's underrated injuries, usage to know about, something a coach said heading into the weekend for your lineups.
Incredible stuff. It's here. Somehow week 1 is upon us. It feels like it sneaks up every year, but I could not be more excited to get some real games to talk about on this podcast very shortly. On that note, Thursday, tomorrow, we debut the Fantasy Film Room with Nate Tice. We're going to do some big picture stuff, but we're also going to do some deep dives on the Thursday night kickoff game between the Ravens and Chiefs. And, man, week 1, so special. Multiple games before Sunday. Friday's Packers-Eagles matchup. Until then, we're out.